Ladies and gentlemen, a big Twisted Storytellers welcome for Saundra Gilliard, all the way from Philadelphia.
Thank you. When I was 14 years old, I was faced with making the biggest decision of my life. I had to choose the dress that my mother would be buried in. It was just me and my mother, so I was her only next of kin, and I had the responsibility of making all of the final arrangements. But because my mother was on welfare, the state took care of all the details, except for purchasing the dress that she would be viewed in. So that responsibility became mine. Now, my mother and I, we didn't belong to church, and we didn't belong to any religious affiliation, so I wasn't sure what proper burial attire was. I always thought that you buried your loved ones in something that they would have wanted, or something that a family member wanted to see them in. So I went to my mother's closet, and I wanted to make sure that I buried her in something that we both would be proud of. And as I looked in that closet, I saw my mother's form-fitting red dress. My mother had this red dress that every time she wore it, the women would suck their teeth and roll their eyes, and under their breath, they go, Jezebel. Now, my mother's name was Mary Alice, so I didn't know who Jezebel was. But I knew she must be bad, because the women always rolled their eyes and sucked their teeth. But my mama didn't care. She always said, baby, I don't give a good goddamn about what those people say about me. And she would strut in her red dress. Now, there was something special about that red dress, because every time my mother put that dress on, it would become like a superhero cape. My mother would transform. And that red dress gave me an opportunity to see my mother emerge as this superwoman, because that was something that I didn't see in our normal interactions. You see, my mother was an alcoholic. Now, I say alcoholic now because I'm educated and because I learned that alcoholism is a disease. But back in 1971, I called my mother a drunk just like everybody else. See, I lived in one of those neighborhoods where the worst thing that you could be socially was a drunk. Now, we had heroin users, we had prostitutes, we had thieves, we had convicted criminals, we even had number runners. But the worst thing in my neighborhood was a drunk. And my mama's only redeeming quality, at least as far as I could see, my mama wasn't no pissy drunk. See, my mama made it to the bathroom each and every time. And she had flawless skin. And my mother took care of her responsibility, so I didn't care what people say, because my mother wasn't no pissy drunk. But my mother was a drunk, and I knew it. My mother died, and everybody expected it, because my mother had been drinking since she was 18. So when she died at the age of 32, nobody was surprised, including me. By the time I was 8, I knew my mother's drink of choice. My mother needed a shot of Bacardi, 151 straight. And before I went to school, I would line Bacardi glasses all over the house so that we could control her income. See, if my mother drank too much, she'd fall into a drunken stupor. And if I didn't leave enough, she would go into DTs and start chasing little green men all around the house. Well, in either crisis, they would take my mother to the G building. Well, that was the mental ward in our local hospital, because at that time, they didn't know how to treat alcoholism. They just put drunks in a crazy house with everybody else. And when that happened, I always had to find an adult who I could negotiate with in order to sign my mother out. So I didn't mind giving my mother what she needed to survive, because I took care of my mother, because my mother took care of me. My mother may have been a drunk, but what those folks didn't say was, each and every time my mother took a drink, she found a way to keep the cleanest apartment in our project building. And my mother always kept my belly filled. And I was always the best dressed girl on the block, because my mama didn't want nobody thinking that her baby wasn't loved. And my mother was mild, and she never fight, but she cut you too short to shit if you mess with her baby. See, my mother loved me, and I knew it. I was my mama's pride and joy. I was all she had. So my mama made sure that I was taken care of. You know, I was my mother's Gotham City. You know, like Batman protected Gotham City? Well, that's the way my mother protected me. And so when she wore her red dress, she became my superhero. So I thought about my mama, and I decided that I would bury her in that red dress. So I took it out the closet, and I wrapped it in a white sheet. And I walked that dress down to the funeral parlor because I was proud that I had the opportunity to dress my mother for the last time. And when I got it down to the funeral parlor, there was the funeral director there. She was a woman. And I thought that she'd make sure that my mama looked good in that red dress. So I handed her the dress, and she took it out of the sheet. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. She said, "Gal, I know you ain't gonna bury your mama looking like no Jezebel." Well, there was that word again. The word Jezebel. And I looked at her, and I didn't say a word. There was nothing said. And I thought to myself, if she think I'm going to change my mother's dress, she got another thought coming. Because after all, I was Mary Alice's daughter. So I went on home, and I thought about what she had said, but then I remembered again how my mother used to feel when she put on that red dress. Well, see, that was the first dress that my mother ever brought from a store downtown that still had the tags on it. And when she brought it home, she was so proud. And my mother had a ritual when she wore that red dress. Now, that red dress was only reserved for Friday nights, because that's the night the eagle flew down at that bar at the corner. And everybody in there had pockets that were built with things to barter with. And my mama knew that. So she had this ritual. She would soak in a tub full of Epsom salt with a touch of bleach, just to keep her elbows and her knees from getting dark. And then she would pat herself with the white towel that was reserved only for that reason. You couldn't touch that white towel any other time. And while her skin was still moist, my mother would grease herself with this concoction she made from Vaseline, baby oil, and some drops of Gina. And she would start from the head on down to every part of her body was glistening. And then she went to her dresser, and she got her coveted topaz perfume. Now, nobody couldn't touch that topaz perfume. And as much as my mama loved me, I couldn't even go over there and sniff it too long. My mother loved her topaz, and she taught me that when you use it, you only put it on those special places. And when that was done, you had to take the powder puff that came with the topaz powder, and you dab it in the powder, and then you put it on the places where women should not perspire. And so, when my mother finished that part of the ritual, she'd take down her red dress and she'd lay it across the bed. Then she'll run over to her little record player and she would take this record 45 that had a red and black label, and she'll put it on the record machine, and then she'll take a nickel and put it on the needle, and then she would play this record. And before Aretha could say R-E-S-P-C-T, found out what it means to me, my mother had her little routine down. She was singing respect. My mother put on her dress to respect, R-E-S-P-C-T-T. Then she would draw on her eyebrows. She put a little mole on the right side of her lip. And then she would take that eyebrow pencil, and with precision, she would draw a line down the back of each and every leg. Now, as I told you, my mama transformed when she put on that dress, because if my mother was drunk during this time, all of a sudden, she'd be straight. I remember one time my mother was so drunk that she had to take 4 steps backwards in order to move 2 steps forwards. But when she got into that red dress, she straightened up and she flied right. And I used to love to see her walk down the street. And I used to watch the women suck their teeth, roll their eyes, and whisper, Jezebel. And my mother always said, I don't give a good goddamn about what you say about me. So I remember that red dress well. And the next day, when I went back to the funeral parlor, I didn't know what to expect. I hadn't heard from the funeral director. I hadn't called her, and she hadn't called me. But I looked in my mother's casket for the very last time, and my mother was wearing a pale yellow, ugly church dress. I couldn't believe it. My mother was right. Those people didn't give a damn about who she was and the way she lived. They wouldn't even give her the respect of dying the way she lived. And I sat there and I just watched, and it took me back to my mother. See, my mother wasn't much to them because they called her drunk. But what they didn't know was that my mother was a hero to me. My mother spent her entire life preparing me to survive when she died. By the time I was 8 years old, I knew how to go and buy a money order to make sure the rent was paid by the 5th of the month. I knew how to cook grits, gravy, and biscuits. I knew how to barter with food stamps for both food and for the other things that we needed. I knew how to wash and purchase my own clothes. And I knew one important thing, that I should always stay in school. Because my mama always told me that a good education gave you a good chance to keep some good change in your pockets. So she always said, I didn't go, but you better finish. And I did. And I remember my mother always saying to me that never give a good goddamn about what people say to you. So when I looked at her in that casket in that ugly, pale yellow dress, I was thinking to myself, what is my mother thinking now? But I knew she would be concerned about me, because my mother prepared me at 14 years old the way that nobody prepared her at 18. And I often thought to her, I said, Mom, you know, life is rough living on my own at 14. And I'm always reminded that she prepared me the way nobody prepared her. And I often ask her in life, that's what I was afraid to ask her in life. I said, Mom, why did you drink? But then I remembered how hard it was living in a big city, all alone, 14 years old, black, and a female. And I was wondering if my mother ever got taken advantage of, if she was ever abused, if she was ever neglected. And then I understood why my mother drank. See, my mother had prepared me for those things, but nobody prepared her. And so by the time I was walking in my mother's shoes at 14, I knew what to do. See, my mother prepared me to survive. And she never had that. So she needed her alcohol and her red dress to give her what she gave me. See, they became her tools to live for me when she didn't even want to live for herself. And I understood that. So when I made the decision on behalf of my mother to bury her in her red dress, that's what I wanted to remember her in. But here I was, looking at my mother and that ugly, pale yellow church dress, a representation of what somebody else thought of my mother. And I watched them, didn't say a word, couldn't even cry. And they closed the casket. And that was the last I saw my mother in, was that ugly, pale yellow dress. So I watched them as they lowered her body down in the ground. And I threw all my memories that I had of my mother right there in the grave with her. And I was hoping that by some magical way, she would use her superpowers and transform herself and put on that red dress, that cape that I knew. But they started throwing dirt on her grave, just like they did when she was alive. And when they finally filled that hole with dirt, I knew my mother was buried there right along with my memories of her in that form-fitting red dress. And I said goodbye to my mother, and I left those memories. And from that point on, in April of 1971, I called my mother a drunk. And I started to refer to her like everybody else. And then I had children. Had a husband, went through a divorce unexpectedly. And I began to feel some of those pains that my mother would never know. But I understood why she needed that 151 in one hand and that red dress in the other. But my mother told me about her life that liquor was not the way to go. So I chose to buy me a red dress. And whenever I put that red dress on, I could feel my mother's spirit. I could feel the energy that she got from that red dress. And times have changed since my mother was alive, because when I put on my red dress, the women, they don't roll their eyes and suck their teeth and call me Jezebel. They call me Hot Mama. And now, I am my mother's daughter, and I started to turn around to cuss them out, but I could hear my mother's voice in the back of my mind going, girl, don't you give a good goddamn about what those people say about you. And I don't, because I know that I'm a hot mama, because I understand the power in the color red. See, those people thought of red as being sinful, sexy, siren. But when I learned who Jezebel was, the bad girl in the Bible, the one who made her own morals, the one who broke all the rules, The one who knew how to use what she got to get what she want. I said, they had my mama pegged right. My mama is Jezebel. And now I'm proud because I'm a red hot mama. Thank you.
Saundra Gilliard.